All right, awesome. Thank you very much for the intro. Thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in the city, and it's been a great experience so far. As was introduced, my name is Jack. That's me on Twitter, where you can find me. I'll also tweet a link to the slides later, and it's got all the links and references and things, so don't worry about writing stuff down straight away. So yeah, I think when I leave here, when I leave Bratislava, I'm going to have two memories from it. First is going to be the amazing scenery in the city. It's an amazing place, and thank you very much for inviting me here. But I'd also like to personally thank Christina, because this was me last night in the hotel elevator waiting to go to dinner for half an hour. It got very warm, a bit weird, a bit tense, and I had to ring Christina to come and get the people to come and get us out of the elevator. So yeah, without her, I wouldn't even be here today. I'd still be in that elevator. And from now on, I'll be taking steps to avoid them. Right, yeah, that's quite a good pun, I think. I stole that from a coworker. Someone laughed down here. Yeah, thank you. So I work at a company called Thread in London, but the talk today is actually based on work I did at a previous company, a company called Songkick. And just to give you a bit of background on the talk, Songkick was a ticket-selling company. So we sold tickets to music gigs. So big artists go on a big tour, and we'd sell them tickets. The product I worked on was called The Store. And this is what it looked like in its unstyled, kind of plain state. So for a particular artist, we have like their fan club in the top left where fans can sign in and get discounts and special offers. And you have a list of all the different dates and venues this artist is performing at. And what happened is we take this and we'd style it and we put it into an artist's website. So for example, we sold tickets for Adele. And this is that same product, but styled and placed to look like it's on Adele's site. It's actually embedded within an iframe. There's a whole other talk on iframes that I'm not going to subject you to. And then we'd sell the tickets and we'd post them to happy fans who would get them, and then people would go to gigs and have a great time, and that's what we did. I'm telling you this because this is the product that founds this talk. We called it The Store, so I just want to be super clear. When I'm talking about the store in this talk, I'm talking about the Songkick ticket store. Store in front end, particularly with things like Redux, is quite an overloaded term, but store here means the Songkick product. It was started, 2-3 years ago. It was built on Angular 1. Tickets were being sold pretty much 24/7 through it, and it was used by all our big flagship clients like Adele. And the store actually worked pretty well. If we just needed to keep the store in its current state and not do anything else with it, we probably wouldn't have done the migration that we did. The issue was that we found changing it, fixing bugs, was really, really tricky. It was quite an old code base that had been around for a long time and seen a lot of different people working on it, a lot of features added and removed. It was running, when I joined, on a very old version of Angular 1, which made it more tricky. And also, all the developers who had previously worked on it had left. So kind of a combination of all those factors made it very hard to work on and be confident in it. Effectively, we lacked confidence in this application. Yes, it ran, it worked, it sold tickets, and we were successful doing that. However, if there was a bug that came up or we needed a new feature, it could take a very long time relative to what that feature was, because we just couldn't move through the system with confidence. I'm sure all of you in the room know what that's like. When you're fighting against this big code base that's making it really hard to ship one tiny change, that's a very frustrating place to be in. So really, I want to break this migration down for you into the 4 T's. We've got the tech, the tests, the team, and talking. So this talk is 50% roughly focused on the technical aspects. But then what surprised me is throughout this migration, I learned a lot of non-technical things that I hadn't learned before, which I wanted to share with you as well. So we will start with the tech. It's probably no surprise, being that this is ReactiveConf, that we picked React as the thing to migrate to. This talk, although we migrated to React, there's a lot of stuff in here that I think is true of any migration from any library to any other library. I won't go into too many reasons why we picked React. We were big fans of it, effectively, and there were some other reasons. But you could swap React here for the new version of Angular, or Ember, or Vue, or any of the other frameworks, and this talk would still make sense. So once we decided that we did want to move, and we wanted to move our code base forward, we had this question of how are we going to do it? Do we do a big bang release where we build a brand new app from the ground up and we release it one day and customers start using that? Or do we do an incremental rewrite where we build slowly, bit by bit, into React? There are benefits to both. There are negatives to both as well. But the thing that we focused on was when we could add value. So if we build in big bang, so we're going to build completely from the scratch. We've got a legacy app and we've got the brand new app. And over time, the new app grows as it gets closer to being the feature set that the legacy app offers. But the issue is, throughout here, you still have to maintain that legacy app. If you fix a bug or deal with an issue in the legacy app, you're probably going to have to do it all over again in the brand new app. And it's only here, right at the very end of this cycle, where you actually release the new app that you add value. Until then, all your users have still been using this old app whilst you're building a brand new one. This is also much risky in terms of deploying. Like if one day you just switch everyone to the new app, that could be very risky and go quite badly. But if you go from the other approach and you start building from the inside out, you can actually add value straight away. So you find a tiny bit of your app, and you turn that from, in our case, Angular to React. And immediately you've then added some value because you've turned some older code that you weren't happy with into some new code that you were. And again, we went Angular to React, but you could swap those out for whichever frameworks you happen to be working with. So effectively doing it this way, you just keep adding more and more value. Every time you migrate a piece of code, you've added value to the app, and your users are benefiting too. Going bit by bit like this lets us release early and often, which is really good. It lets you learn as you migrate. So you might migrate one component to React and learn some things. Oh, I didn't really do that as well as we'd like. We can do that better next time. And you can just do that because you're releasing it in very small incremental steps. This also doesn't break any existing functionality, and it means if a critical bug pops up in your app, just because you're migrating, it doesn't mean you can take the time to fix that bug. Martin Fowler actually calls this the strangler application. You're kind of strangling the app from the inside out. I like to think of it as like aliens, where the aliens burst through the chest. That's kind of what I was going for. And really the main benefit to this was that we shipped migrated code the day after we started the migration. We found the smallest bit that we could migrate, and we migrated it. Took a few hours, we shipped it live, and that was it. So it was a really nice feeling that we could start shipping straight away and really impact the application. And for those who are really interested in the specifics of Angular to React and how we did this, I'm happy to go into more detail kind of in person, so please come and find me. But at a high level, what we were dealing with is loads of components. Or in Angular, they were called directives. But for the purpose of this talk, an Angular directive really maps pretty closely to a React component. And when you build apps out of components or Angular directives, you end up effectively with big trees. So you've got one component at the top that renders two others, that each render three more, that render some more, and so on. So our plan was we found the smallest bit we could, one of these ones right at the bottom, and we swapped it out for React. Then we continued with all its siblings, so we swapped all those out for React. And at that point, you've got an Angular thing rendering a bunch of React stuff, so then you can very easily lift all of that into React. And effectively, that's the process. You just keep doing that on and on. So if we take a bit more of a concrete example, if you look at the app and you start breaking it down into components, you see we have the fan club banner, and we have a listings row. But of course, the listings row is still pretty high level, so you can break that down even further into the smaller bits. So the date of the listing, the title and the venue, and then some buttons to let you buy VIP or normal tickets. The listings date was actually the very first thing we migrated. So to migrate a component from Angular to React, we first write the new React component, whatever goes in. And one of the key things we decided with this migration is that the React components we write should have no specific Angular React kind of integration code in them. We should be able to just write pure React components and not worry about the fact they're being embedded into an Angular system. So there's nothing special about these React components. They are exactly like any React components anyone else is writing. And then we had to try and insert this into Angular. So at the time, and bear in mind we're on quite an old version of Angular 1, Angular directives were inserted via templates that used custom elements effectively. So this listings-button would be an Angular directive. And we needed to swap that out for our brand new React component. And there's this really great library that I want to give a shout out to called ng-react, which lets you render React within Angular. It just provides a couple of directives that make this really easy to do. For the purposes of migrating from one to the other, this was an absolute lifesaver and saved us a lot of time. So we can effectively take this, and we can swap it out for a React component directive that renders our React component onto the screen. So now we've done the button, we might continue and do the title. So we swap out the title for another React component. And at this point, we're basically at this stage in the tree. So now what we do is we create a React component to encompass all of this. So we create our listings item component that has the title and the button component inside it. Again, this is just a regular React component. And now our Angular template just becomes one React component reference that renders all that together. And that gets us there, effectively. Again, if anyone really cares more about the specifics, come and find me, because I can tell you more. But I'm aware this is fairly niche, so I didn't want to go into too much detail. And effectively, we did that on and on and on to migrate more of our app. And as we're doing this, we're running this in production, and we're deploying it on most days we would do a deploy with some form of change. And we can't break this thing. We're selling tickets all the time. So there were a load of unit tests. They were written in Angular via Karma. We moved over to Jest, just because for us personally, we preferred it more, especially for React tests. And we saw a good glimpse of Jest yesterday. Again, not going to go into too much detail here, but I have written a blog post on this, and I'll share the slides later too. But of course, unit tests, to some degree, are always going to be coupled to the implementation. When you write a React component or an Angular component, the tests for that are going to be very much tied to it. So when you migrate the Angular component, you also have to update and change the tests to make them relevant to the new React component. What was really valuable for us was some acceptance tests. And these are great because we ran them via Protractor, via Selenium. And these are entirely detached from the code. They actually load up the app in a browser, click around it, and see what's broken or what's working and report stuff to us. And when you're changing so much of the underlying code, having tests that don't care what the code is, if it's Angular or React, was really, really valuable. There are some downsides, and this is what they looked like. We also ran ours primarily in IE, because that's the browser we didn't want to test in manually the most, although we did have to sometimes. There are some downsides to these things. They're slow to run. I'm sure anyone else who's done these kind of end-to-end acceptance tests knows like some of the pain that there is in them. They will often fail for no apparent reason. So there is kind of some downsides. So we picked 4 or 5 key user journeys through the application to make sure we had tested. That meant even if we deployed something that was a bit buggy, we knew that users could still buy tickets, which is the primary kind of thing they want to do on our app. So moving on from that, I want to talk a bit more about the team and how we managed this whole project. We knew this migration was going to be at least 6 months long, more likely a year. It turned out to be about a year. And for me personally, that was the longest project I'd ever worked in one continuation. Normally, I've worked in like smaller sprint-style things, or you had a 4-week project, or maybe even a 3-month project. But to have at least a year's worth of work ahead of you was pretty daunting. So organizing that and keeping everyone kind of happy and productive and feeling like we've got good momentum was pretty tricky. Of course, in your head, in an ideal world, the migration would look like this. Just be a straight line going up, and it would all go smoothly. And then maybe in a still pretty ideal world, it might look a bit like this. You hit a few roadblocks, but on the whole, it's a pretty smooth progression. Or in the real world, it looks like this very scientific graph that I drew that shows really that you go back a few steps and you progress, and then you make big leaps forward, and then you realize that something went wrong, and you come back down again. So kind of keeping everyone on board and happy and having the work planned whilst hitting these roadblocks made it quite an interesting project to deal with. And really, this comes down to how do you prioritize? When you have a year's worth of work ahead of you, and you've got to do all of it, you've got to migrate the entire thing, how on earth do you start to pick what you're going to work on? One of our goals, and one of the things we struggled with the old Angular app, was that we wanted to make it easier to fix bugs with confidence. That was the thing we hated the most, that we couldn't move quickly. If we fixed a bug, we'd have to spend a few hours manually testing various edge cases just to make sure. So we kind of let that feed into how we prioritized. So we picked work based on the bugs and the churn rate, not so much the code quality. And what I mean here by churn rate is it's the amount of times a developer in your team will touch a given file. So say there's a file, it's a component somewhere, and you don't like how it's written. It's really badly written in your opinion. However, its functionality is watertight, users don't hear any bugs with it, and it works perfectly. That's pretty low priority. Although you don't like the code, the fact that it's working makes it a pretty good thing to just leave alone. But if there's a file that you have to edit every single week as you're doing other bits of work, and that file's tricky to edit, that's got quite a high churn rate because you're touching it a lot, and therefore it's probably something you should look to prioritize sooner. So given these kind of files with code quality, churn rate, and bug rate, we picked more so on the churn and the rate of bugs rather than the actual quality of the code. So in this case, we'd pick the bottom one as the highest priority. And this is how I would prioritize those. You might disagree a little bit and do them slightly differently, but kind of treating code quality as the lowest priority thing to decide on actually works pretty well. And it's also important here to mix larger bits of work with lots of small bits of work too. I love working on long projects, like getting stuck into a project for a few weeks, but then sometimes it's also nice to bash 3 tiny bugs out in a couple of days and deploy lots of stuff rapidly. So we had a massive backlog. We happen to use Trello, it doesn't matter what the tool is, that had a big mix of stuff, so developers could pick stuff off. If you had a spare afternoon, you could find a really small thing to migrate. If you had a longer piece of time, you'd pick up a bigger bit of work. And even when we had to do really large rewrites, I mean, some parts of this system were pretty big, and we had to do them in one big go, we were still able to break those down into lots of smaller cards. Again, Trello's checklists are quite a good way to do this. The tool doesn't really matter. But breaking this down also meant that you didn't have like 4 weeks without merging a single thing on GitHub. The fact that you could do lots of small bits and still feel progress was really nice. And we used feature branches quite a lot to do this. So one of the big projects we did was we rebuilt the queue. So the queue is the thing customers get stuck in when they're waiting to buy tickets, such that if we have 100,000 people trying to buy Adele tickets, they don't all hit our servers at once and crash our entire system. So we put them in a queue. And we rebuilt this from scratch in React over 2 or 3 weeks. But rather than do one big code review and big release at the end, we tried to break it down. So what we did is we had our master branch, and we pulled off a queue master. And then we did lots of small bits of work on those, corresponding to the checklist on Trello, and we'd merge them in small bits, getting code review at each stage. So by the time it came for the actual queue master branch to be merged into our actual master and be deployed, most of the code had already been reviewed. This was a really nice way to keep things going and also spare a developer from like a 1,000-line code review at the end. We all know if you give a developer 5 lines of code to review, they will leave about 10 comments. If you give them 1,000 lines to review, they'll leave 1 comment at best. So doing lots of small code reviews also keeps the quality up there. And this is, again, part of our releasing early, releasing often. It encourages those small pull requests and units of work. It keeps the momentum on the team, and it keeps risk to a minimum. If you're deploying lots of small things and suddenly users report they can't buy tickets, you can track that down and roll back the thing you just deployed. And it's a really small thing rather than a much bigger thing. This also means if there is a sudden bug, you can deal with it much more quickly. And when you're migrating, you'll often find bits of work that end up being way more complicated than you think. There might be a bit of, say, a date on a page that you think, oh, that's easy to migrate. But then once you start using it, you'll see that there's a few weird things it does. It pulls in this external library that's a bit weird, or it depends on some code that you're not a big fan of. And suddenly, what you thought you could get done in an hour might end up taking you a day or 2 days. And you might not have that day or 2 days right now. So what we tried to kind of put in place this scouts rule that says just leave things better than when you found them. So you load up a component you're going to migrate, you realize it's much more complicated, you've only got an hour, you can't do it. Rather than not do any of it, you could start that work. You could rewrite a bit of the JavaScript to leave it in a better place when we do come to migrate it. And it's important to remember that a migrated codebase is not a perfect codebase. This is something that I fell into and a lot of people seem to. If you're migrating, in our case, Angular to React, you're not expected to write the best React components that have ever existed during your migration. It's just not going to happen. You're probably going to have to make a few hacks or tweaks to make the React component play nicely, and that's absolutely fine. What we found is it was more important to migrate, get off, in our case, Angular to React, and then we could refactor the React components as we saw fit, but moving them off Angular was the most important step. So don't be afraid of migrating and being aware that you want to rewrite what you've just migrated. That's perfectly fine. And again, we had a thing in Trello with just a list of things we wanted to do. And really, the way to think about this is the next time you touch a piece of code or a component, you'll know more about it than you did the last time because you've worked on it a bit more. So you can never make it perfect the first time. It's always going to need you to work on it a few times before you really get a sense of how it should work. And another thing we wanted to avoid that was one of the issues when it came to planning this migration was the lottery factor. Now, I think some companies would call this the bus factor, and this is if someone gets hit by a bus, like how screwed are you? That's a bit kind of depressing and morbid, so we went for the lottery factor. So if I win the lottery and retire to an island somewhere sunny, which, by the way, is totally not London, then how is the team going to be? Can they move without me? Really, this is if someone goes on holiday for a couple of weeks, are we okay or not? And this came down to really trying to share knowledge. As we're migrating, you find common gotchas or bits of info, tidbits of information that are going to be really useful for other developers. And putting them somewhere where people will actually read them and keep it up to date can be a challenge. We tried Google Docs, but that's too far detached from the code, so they got out of date very quickly. GitHub wikis, kind of same problem. You don't really see them that much. And we actually ended up with a really lo-fi solution. We just created a markdown file in the actual code app itself called knowledge base. Knowledge base is a rather grand term for what is effectively some random notes in Markdown, but it's just a place to dump bits of information that you find useful. And it was really useful to be able to refer to this. Or I'd say, oh, I just fixed this particular problem, and I put something in the knowledge base, and people could read it. Because it was right next to the code, we found we were more likely to keep it in sync and up to date. And when you've got some really long-running projects like this, the most important thing was to have some metrics to track your actual progress. There's a year's worth of work here, and actually figuring out how far along is very tricky. And sometimes it can feel like there's just a never-ending tunnel of work ahead of you, and there's no actual end in sight. And I'm not talking like really fleshed out, perfect, polished metrics here. I'm talking really rough metrics. So this was one that grepped a bunch of files for any mention of Angular and grepped a bunch of files for any mention of React. And it gave me the number of files it found. So at this point, we were on, 126 Angular files and 122 React files. This is like the worst metric in the world because it's incredibly inaccurate. Like a load of files don't mention either React or Angular. Some might mention Angular in a different way. Like this is non-scientific. But it let us see progress because I could run this here and you can see the numbers, 126, 122. If I run it here, I've also changed my terminal theme in case you can't notice. We're now on 80 for Angular and 159 for React. Now, this doesn't actually mean that much, and it doesn't mean we're whatever percentage of the way through. But what it does mean is we're closer than we were when I ran the first screenshot in the first terminal. So this is really nice. Like, we don't share these metrics. They don't mean much. But as a team, just having some numbers that you can see are moving is really nice. And of course, it was important to get the rest of the business on side with this migration and for them to understand it. And I'll come on more to that in a minute. But we also had a spreadsheet that we shared around. And we broke up work into rough points. And based on that, we figured out a percentage of how migrated we were. Now, we're all software developers, or most of us are, and we know that you can't really give a percentage for how migrated you are. It doesn't really work. Like, you can't say we're 64.5% migrated. Like, what does that really mean? But by giving these rough estimates and sharing them around, again, we could track progress, and other teams could get a sense of where we're up to. And in the course of a couple of months, at one point, we moved it from 43 to 70. Again, does that mean we're 70.5% migrated? Probably not. But does it mean we're much more migrated than we were here? Yes, it does. The migration was always a really good chance to upgrade your tooling as well. If you've got any parts of the app you're not happy with, say your test framework or your build tool or any other kind of tools, linting, anything like that, it was a really good chance to upgrade those as well. Given you're rewriting a bunch of stuff anyway, it's a good chance to take some time to figure out your tooling. It's also important, it's also important because it was quite nice sometimes to get a break from the actual migration and just do some tooling stuff. And being able to mix up like longer bits of work, smaller bits of work, tooling work, all sorts of different things kept the project really interesting. So finally, I'd like to talk about talking, or communication, but it was 4 T's, so it has to be talking really, and kind of sharing what we were doing with the wider business. The most important people to convince here weren't actually on the tech team. It was fairly straightforward to convince my colleagues that this was a good idea. They were on board. The CTO kind of understood and was keen for it. But then how do you tell the people who actually deal with this application every day? People like customer support who get angry emails when users can't buy tickets they want because of a bug. The people who deal with the artists who are using our store who complain when something's not quite right. You have to tell those people that for a year, you're not going to be adding that many features because you're rebuilding it from the inside out. And like selling that is quite tricky. And I don't know if this is a surprise to just me, but it turns out they don't really care about frameworks. It's just us who care about frameworks, which is mind-blowing, right? So when I first started kind of communicating, sent an email around the business saying why we're doing this, I used things like React's lifecycle methods and small API is easier for developers to learn. Or React's state model is less magical. Its unidirectional data flow really simplifies code and makes it easy. Like, what does that really mean? Does anyone, if someone could tell me what that means, please come and find me, because I still don't know what I'm talking about half of the time. And if I don't know, and we can't communicate that, how are people outside of engineering going to know what that means? And how is that going to sell them the benefits of doing this work? So really, it was a case of flipping it and talking to them about how it is from their perspective or their point of view. Things like when you ask us for a new bug, not a new bug, I'm expert at new bugs. When you ask us for a new feature or a fix to an existing bugs, right now we can't do it. Or we can do it, but it takes 3 times longer than it should. And we don't have confidence that we don't break something elsewhere. We can improve our mobile performance because we have a lot of dead code as part of this migration we can rip out. And we can make things on mobile much nicer, which should lead to more tickets being sold and happier users and so on and so forth. So this was how we started to get people outside the business understanding the benefits to this migration. Another way of doing this that comes back to the prioritization that I was talking about earlier is that if you can fix bugs that cause pain for other departments and prioritize those based in, during the year-long project, this will get you a lot of friends in a lot of places. So we had a bug that had been existing for over a year, which is a few users, maybe 1 in tens of thousands, very, very rarely, would get stuck when they entered their credit card, they'd hit submit, and it would freeze and nothing would happen. And those people would miss out on tickets, which if you're in a queue for tickets and you've been sat at your computer for 2 hours waiting for tickets, like that really sucks. And people are understandably very, very angry. And customer support were fed up of dealing with these people when the tech team had this issue for a year that we just couldn't fix. So we said, well, let's migrate that bit. So we did, we migrated it, and we kind of communicated this. We used Slack, but again, whatever tool you happen to use, saying, we fixed it, keep me informed like if it happens again, but we're in a much better place now. And after this day, we didn't see the issue again. So that really communicates to me like the benefit, and it communicates to, in this case, Kaylin from the customer support team, the benefits of this work and why we're doing it. And it communicates it much better than React is better than Angular or whatever technical reasons we may have had. So it's important to make sure you keep everyone in the loop with this project as it's going on. And of course, sometimes when you are migrating and it's a complex bit of software, things will go wrong. You can put all the tests in place, you can do all the checks, but ultimately now and then you will deploy some broken code. It's just a fact of being a developer. And when you do that, it's important to kind of react to that in the right way and deal with it. Sometimes we will break things. And I found this on Twitter, and I always include it. There are two types of developer in the world. There are those who have broken production, and there are those who are about to break production. So I'd like to personally apologize to 3 people who bought tickets for a concert on the wrong day in Tokyo because of me. It turns out time zones are tricky, like again, who knew? So yeah, we did fix that, by the way, and got them new tickets, but that kind of really sucked. That was also like a week into the migration that I did that, and it wasn't the best way to start. But it's kind of, you've got to acknowledge it and kind of figure out why that happened and how can we prevent it again. So we always ask, what went wrong? Why didn't we catch it? How can we fix it? And most importantly, how will we prevent it happening again? So in that case, it was a time zone bug. It was a time zone bug when you were only in basically not British time. For some reason, it affected New York time and like Tokyo time. So if we were ever doing any date work, I just manually set my computer to that date time and test it there. Things like that. We had a list of like common things we've messed up before that we can fix now. And it's important to remember with this migration, it's a two-way street. There's a lot of other people outside the tech team invested in it, and you need to keep them informed. So just to end, some takeaways. Don't migrate for the sake of it. Like, just because this went on Angular, that's not why we migrated. We couldn't fix things. We couldn't move quickly. And again, just to be clear, I'm not hating on Angular. Like, we could have migrated from Angular 1 to Angular 2. We could have migrated from Angular to Ember, to Vue, whatever. It's just, in our case, we picked React. Plan, and plan again. Cross-business communication is so important, and you should start that earlier. I waited a couple of months before I really understood that people need to know about this stuff. If I'd have started sooner, a lot of things would have been smoother. Prioritize more so based on the current pain points in your application for you and for other stakeholders, users, customer support, and so on. Have a bunch of different tasks so that the work is kind of fresh and interesting. Have some metrics, both internally and externally, and they can be really hacky metrics that you come up with in a couple of hours. And don't expect to migrate perfectly the first time. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening. Before I go, just going to do a quick self-plug, as always. I blog on the javascriptplayground.com. It's entirely free. It's just that it's available. We've seen a lot of CSS and JS discussions recently. I did a video tutorial with Glenn Madden, one of the co-creators of Style Components, which I think a lot of people would find interesting. So that's at javascriptplayground.com. I don't know if I have time for questions now. If I don't, I'm around all today. I'm also in the Elm workshop tomorrow helping out, so come and find me there. Or if you don't get a chance, you can tweet me as Jack_Franklin. I'll also tweet the slides with the hashtag, and I'm jack@thread.com as well. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jack. We do have time for 1 or 2 questions, so we should go through them. The first one is something I can even understand, how to convince the business guys such a refactor is worth it, especially if the current product is actually working and makes money.
It was working with some common issues and bugs. For example, payment processing, that bug had been around for ages, and we'd actually tried to fix it like 4 or 5 times. There was another bug where people got stuck in the queue. So they'd be in the queue for, say, 2 hours, then we'd run out of tickets, so we'd close the queue, and that should kick everyone out. But for, like, again, 1 in a few thousand users, they would be stuck in this queue. There was a poor person who spent 8 hours at their laptop in a queue for tickets for an event, even though it had sold out after like an hour, things like that. So although it did work, there were outstanding issues we need to fix, and also we're in a period of iterating a lot on the product and adding a lot of new features as well. If it had just worked, we probably wouldn't have done such an aggressive migration.
So the next question is, swapping tiny bits is great, but you're loading both frameworks. What about performance?
Yeah, that is the downside to this approach, is you do have to load both frameworks in. For us, we decided that penalty wasn't really worth it because we happened to have quite a big application already, and we knew performance wasn't great. but we felt that with the code in the situation, there was limited kind of impact we could have on the performance with it in its current state. So we were willing to pay that cost to add React in to get the benefits later on. But that is certainly a consideration when it comes to like big bang release or iterative approach.
And the last question is, any reason for using React instead of Angular 2?
For us, it was just that not many people in the team, myself included, were super familiar with Angular 2. Not many of us, I was pretty familiar with Angular 1. We were all familiar with React. Songkick actually had another product that had been built in React recently, so there was much more knowledge of React, and that was really the prime factor. There was no one on the team like really who knew and was evangelizing Angular 2, whereas there were a lot who knew React.
Jack, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.